IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Pranay and I am back on ATP after a long time. And today I have with me my colleagues Satya and Miheer to discuss on a new important paper that they have written. So before we begin, I want you folks to introduce yourselves because it's a new appearance. So Miheer, please introduce yourself. Who are you and what are you doing at Takshashila?
Hi Pranay, thank you for that. So I'm Miheer Karandikar. I'm final year BSc Economics student in Gokhale Institute of Politics in Pune. I'm very interested in topics like environmental economics and high-tech geopolitics. And currently I'm doing an internship in Takshashila in which I worked on the paper on the information technology agreement for the last 1.5 months. And I'll be talking about that today.
So looks like you had a productive internship. You already written a paper on an important...
Yeah. It's been great working here.
Cool. So, Satya, I hope you had good fights with Miheer while writing this paper.
Not zero fights, but the brainstorming is amazing, by the way. Like, without the brainstorming that we had in his background in economics and his visualization skills, it's great. So it's been a great partner to co-author to write this.
I'm disappointed you guys didn't fight while writing the paper. But anyway, so let's get to this document. So first of all, before we begin there, I'll just give a background to our listeners because this is a specialized topic, but it is very relevant to every news item that you're seeing in business newspapers nowadays. Just today, for example, there was news article that India's smartphone exports have risen to the top 5 of the exports in India in the last financial year. And there have been various debates on semiconductors, on things related to electronics manufacturing. There have been arguments by Raghuram Rajan. There have been responses by the METI minister, Sir Ashwini Vaishnav, etc. Right? So there has been a lot of things discussed on electronics manufacturing in general. And one specific area related to that is what should India's trade policy be with respect to electronics and semiconductors. So there is a lot of things brewing on that. I'll just give a background. So India is currently caught up in a quarrel over tariffs over information and communication technology goods. So ICT goods is the technical terminology the WTO uses. So the EU has filed a WTO dispute that India has applied up to 20% of tariff on ICT goods, such as mobile phones and accessories, which is technically against the Information and Technology Agreement ITA 1. Right? And signatories under this were supposed to levy a maximum tariff of 0% on a set of pre-agreed ICT goods. But India has not done that. That's what the EU, Japan and Taiwan claim. So all three of them had filed cases against India. And the WTO ruled against India in all three disputes. So currently India has approached the appellate body in the dispute filed by Japan on May 25, while the EU is threatening to apply retaliatory tariffs. So this can be a very important development and it can affect electronics manufacturing strategy going ahead. So let's discuss this. And you guys have written a paper which argues that India should change its position with respect to the ITA. So let's do a primer first. Satya, tell us what the hell is this ITA and why should we be bothered about it?
Right. So broadly put, Pranay, the ITA is a plurilateral agreement enforced by the WTO. Now, plurilateral agreements are enforced under the aegis of the WTO, which means that all the concepts like the most favored nation, bound tariff rates, and all of that apply to this. There is no divergence in definitions there. Now, this agreement will aim to eliminate all tariffs, like you said, 0% tariff regimes by all the signatories. It was concluded in 1996, entered into force in 97 with around 29 participants. By 2015, however, it has gone to 82 participants and it accounts for almost 97% of world trade in ICT products. in 2015, it was also expanded to cover another 200 more products, stuff like 3D printers and other medical technology, for instance, pacemakers, etc., were expanded to it. And so, again, just going on a tangent here, it did not also take into account facts like, developed countries and least developed countries were on asymmetric balance here. So they did talk about the fact that there are concessions handed out to these countries as well. So it is very much a WTO agreement in that regard.
Okay, no. So can you just go into some more detail? So why was the need for ITA? Why did the WTO come in, and what are the kinds of goods that are covered? Broadly, if you can explain, that will help.
Right. So this happened in 1996. So by then we know that global value chains, the way in which production of ICT products were happening, had already begun to emerge. So Intel, for instance, went to Malaysia to start an assembly plant. So silicon sourcing, etc., stuff like that had already begun to emerge. So by that time, the WTO stepped in to ensure that a free flow of these products, intermediate components, input materials, as well as human capital, right? The different kinds of skilled workforce needed in each part of the value chain, their free movement was also facilitated. So that's why they decided to enter into a plurilateral agreement, which would harmonize the system of products as well as ensure that every single signatory is on the same footing. Right.
So let me rephrase. Yeah. So one idea, I guess, what you're saying is that because there were already global value chains in most of the electronics manufacturing products, especially in semiconductors, countries got into an agreement which said that you should levy zero import tariffs on many of these goods, so that all this diversified manufacturing can happen. You can make the wafer in Taiwan, you can do the assembly in China, you can probably do manufacturing of the OEM product in India, right? So for that, if there were high import tariffs, then this kind of arrangement wouldn't have been possible. So the countries agreed that let us keep import tariffs zero. There will be diversified manufacturing across the various segments of a value chain happening in different countries. We'll utilize the comparative advantage of each countries and let this be a new system in manufacturing. So this is very different from what we had earlier, right? So all countries actually agreeing to zero tariffs is a big move, right? So that was the aim, and the aim was increased trade that will benefit. So now tell me, what has been India's position? So just on this ITA one, in fact, India is actually a laggard in many of these trade agreements. India thinks that most of this will not benefit. So in contrast, on ITA 1, India was one of the first signatories, right? So can you tell us what was India's rationale then, and what is its stance currently?
So India is one of the countries that actually got a concession for a longer implementation period. Mm-hmm. So India's obligations under the ITA 1 were slated to be fulfilled by 2005 instead of other countries who...
Right. So by obligations, you mean India got a concession that it can reduce its tariffs to zero over a longer period of time.
Yeah, it can gradually...
In 1996 itself, right?
Yeah, so it can gradually, year upon year, reduce those. And India did actually do that. And I'll go into the problems with India's current tariff system later. So India's stance right now is India has not joined the ITA 2, by the way.
What is ITA 2?
The expansion of the ITA agreement that was concluded in 2015 and covers 200 more products, has a lot more signatories, right? So India's argument is that it wanted to protect its domestic IT industry. So at the time of signing the ITA, India's idea was, okay, let's get onto the global value chain trend and everything. However, India did not possess industrial capacity or a domestic manufacturing sector, not even assembly properly, by the way. So now, after 20 odd years of that, India's argument is that it's protecting its domestic IT industry from which was almost wiped out and benefited China more. That's the argument. It also wants to preserve its policy space to use tariffs as a tool for industrial development. So that's what we're seeing with Atmanirbhar Bharat and initiatives like the phased manufacturing program for mobile phones, where they want to create more local capacity and source components for mobile phones in India and gradually increase import tariffs to discourage imports of these components. So, and they also said something about ITA 2 would erode its tariff revenues, which is actually problematic because India's total tariff revenue is actually 5% of the GDP, out of which ICT products tariff revenue consists around 0.3%. So these have been India's traditional arguments against the ITA or the expansion of the ITA, but India still maintains on paper that it is in compliance with that. So if you look at the tariff structures under the Customs Act and its schedules, it will say things like printed circuit boards, which are included in the ITA, whose tariff lines stand at 0%. However, if you move forward and go to HS 8517, which is a product category, it talks about populated printed circuit boards for smartphones, which now carry around 15 to 20% tariffs. So this kind of absurd regulations have also come into picture.
Okay, so let me just go back to some of the reasons you already mentioned. So India was, in sharp contrast to current positions, India was one of the early signatories for this particular agreement. It also got good concessions because it was a developing country, a big country, etc. So it didn't have to agree to whatever requirements were on day one. In fact, it got around 7-8 years to comply with it. India did comply with it originally, but over time there has been a sense that has developed in the Indian policy ecosystem that ITA 1 has not helped us, and in fact it has helped just one country, which is China, right? So it is. I found it very surprising to read the government's position on this on the Ministry of Commerce website. It is very direct. It just says that India's experience with ITA 1 has been most discouraging, and the real gainer from this agreement has been China. And then they go on to say that it is time for us to incubate our industry rather than expose it to undue pressures of competition. And that's why we want to levy import tariffs. And that is what the Indian government has done. There is also a sort of more instrumental argument which has been given. So the Indian government is saying, see, the ITA 1, when we signed it, that time there were no smartphones, there were no other products which came up later. So the new tariffs that we have applied are not, in a sense, violative of the ITA 1 agreement. And that's why we have the freedom to impose these new tariffs, is another argument that the Indian government has.
Just
right?
on that, Pranay, so that is the basis of the W2 dispute. And India's arguments range from just basic incompetency that they haven't responded to the WTO when WTO wanted to harmonize its previous product category structure, the HS 2002, the HS 2007, and India did not respond about the product categorization, which would attract tariffs and which would not. And then now it is saying, it is in a clerical error or something. Then, so that aside from gradually increasing tariffs on things like the PCBs I mentioned and PCB products like smartphones, they have also been imposing other cesses and surcharges like social welfare surcharge, safeguard duty, anti-dumping duty. India's argument is that these are not customs duties and therefore not subject to the ITA 1 obligations. None of these arguments are found purchased with the dispute settlement board of the WTO. And so that's the basis.
Right. So we started with a very different trajectory. We signed this agreement, but we've again come to the same conclusion as the government that these kinds of agreements hinder us rather than enable us. Right. So that's where we are today. So before we go into what India should do, is the policy reasoning justified, etc. Miheer, I want you to come into this conversation and tell us what has been the experiences of other countries which have been part of ITA. You've surveyed Vietnam and Malaysia and a few countries. So just educate us about that.
Right. So the government's main argument, or one of its main arguments, was that only China benefited from this, or they kind of say that China benefited massively and they have been the only benefiters. But we try to examine if that is true, and if it is not, then other countries have also benefited from that, right? So when we look at countries that we want to compare to India, we first look at their kind of how similar they are to the demographics of India, like their population, how young it is, their geographic location somewhere around Asia, which is an important characteristic because supply chains are very much dependent on where you are located, right? So we look at 4 countries other than India. So we look at Malaysia, we look at Vietnam, we look at China, and somewhat at Korea, but mainly Malaysia, Vietnam, China, and of course Taiwan, right? So Malaysia, so all of these countries are, of course, signatories on the ITA and also signatories on the expanded ITA, which was signed in 2015. And some of them are also involved in another expansion, which will probably be signed next year or in the next 2 years, right? So let's kind of see what like these countries did. So Malaysia first invested in state-owned company in a state-owned company to try and develop its own semiconductors. Along with that, it had schemes that provided land, electricity, even housing for companies that wanted to establish their factories in the country. And all these so the companies that first came to these countries were involved in packaging, testing, assembly operations in these countries, which didn't exactly include a lot of value addition, but still provided a lot of employment to the country that they were establishing in, right? Which was important because the population was young, the country was probably poor at that time. Similarly, Vietnam also opened up their economy to MNEs pretty quickly. It's a great example because in the 1980s and 1990s, it exported almost nothing, right? But in 2019, it has become the 8th largest exporter for office and telecom equipment in the world, like exporting more than Malaysia, Germany, even Mexico, right?
Yeah. So before you go ahead, Mir, I just want to add on the Vietnam points. You're right that it is a amazing success story on many counts. So, for example, this is from a report Globalized to Localized by Clear. It stated that both Vietnam and India exported the same value of electronics items in 2010. But by 2020, Vietnam's electronics exports had become 7 times that of India's. So within 10 years, that's the divergence, right?
That's
and
right.
Both of these countries are signatories to the ITA, by the way, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and along with the ITA, Vietnam has also signed a lot of FTAs over the years with many countries, regional cooperation groups like the ASEAN and China, and which makes input materials very cheap, which makes exports almost free of cost. Also, the political situation is kind of stable. They have provided different regions in which companies can come, invest, build factories. The country provides a lot of labor. Samsung has a very big factory in Vietnam, and in which it invests a lot of money, and it keeps investing a lot of money. And it has also now started to manufacture semiconductors, not just assemble their phones or something like that. Another example is Taiwan. So Taiwan is one of the success story because it created its own semiconductor companies, which have been very successful, very famous. So the industry was very old. In the 60s, 70s, it started attracting American companies, Japanese companies to come to their country, establish factories. After that, they invested in technology transfers in which companies in Taiwan could get a sort of an old technology from these companies and then invest heavily in research and development to build their own products from the technology that they gained from these companies. And TSMC, which is a Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, is now responsible for 60% of the global market share in semiconductors. Also, Foxconn is a big player. Apple sources its manufacturing chips from Foxconn. And it has always been highly export-oriented. It has always been a signatory to the ITA, and which has provided it cheap input materials initially, and then now, as it exports a lot to other countries, also exports have been cost-free. It has also signed agreement with China, in which trade between these two, between China and Taiwan, it's almost duty-free, including electronics products. But one of the biggest success stories that we can say is, of course, China, right? So as the government says, all these companies have China has benefited, but these countries also have. So trying to look at China, it is a much more mature economy. Even when it did sign the ITA, it signed a little later, I guess, in 2003, if I'm not wrong. But it has invested heavily in education, innovation. It championed its companies like Huawei and ZTE and Xiaomi, and it invested a lot. It gave them subsidies. It gave them easy access to finance. But its main success story has been a lot of multinational entities coming to that country, establishing their products, and then exporting that to other countries, which make it cheaper for them. So yeah, China has, of course, been. So basically what we try to prove is that China has been a success story, but not just China. So all these other countries, which are probably much poorer than India, have also been very, very successful, which has been aided by the ITA.
Right. So I will just do a few corrections. Yeah, these countries, their GDP per capita is higher than India, so they are not poorer than India, definitely. But yeah, you can say that 10, 15 years ago, the state of their electronics exports was not very different from that of India's.
Right.
And yeah, so that's where they are, and that's why that comparison is important. So what we are seeing is that there are a bunch of countries like India broadly which signed the ITA, but their electronics manufacturing has taken off, whereas India, though like these countries also signed the ITA, India's electronics manufacturing didn't take off over the last 10, 15 years, right? So there seems to be a divergence, and government is trying to make this causation that because we signed the ITA, our experience was discouraging and it only benefited China, right? So Satya, is there
Hmm.
any other point you want to add on this?
So just to add to Meher's point about how these countries leverage the ITA one thing we are also forgetting is that technology transfer became essential. The more foreign companies came in, and this began to partner with local companies or with the government. They began training workforces in those countries. They demonstrated technology. So maybe leading edge tech could have been reverse engineered by other. So as workforces shifted between companies or started their own companies in those countries, they began to take these technologies, the learnings, and create success stories of their own. That is something we haven't seen in India simply because we don't have that kind of demonstration technology. Right. And so answering your question about why the government has been incorrectly linking the ITA 1 to India's lagging hardware manufacturing sector is that in the course of our research, we found that it's India's different policies, industrial, fiscal, as well as trade policies have been siloed and non-strategic. So when India liberalized tariffs as per the ITA 1, there was no attempt to link it to a coherent long-term industrial policy for kickstarting the domestic manufacturing industry, right? So what happened was this lack of cohesion resulted in a lot of final ICT products attracting zero tariffs, whilst input components continue to attract duties. So for the IT enabled services sector, which is the largest services the sector in India has in terms of exports, they benefited a lot because they could buy VoIP hardware, all of that at almost zero extra cost. But manufacturing companies, for instance, Micromax is still facing a lot of problems in terms of importing input components to start their own domestic mobile phones. Right. So it had the effect of distorting manufacturing incentives despite the presence of a large consumer market and
No,
what
Satya,
even.
I would disagree with you. Like at that point of time, if there is lower import tariffs in general, it would have also benefited Micromax and the likes, especially because they were able to import products. In fact, the first boom of Indian electronics exports of mobile phones that we saw by Indian players, Micromax, Lava, etc., would have been enabled because of the low import tariffs regime and India stuck with it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to import these products at lower cost, assemble, sell it, or whatever, right? So, don't you
Right.
think that's the case?
Yeah, so you are right in the sense that these companies were at the forefront of India's first boom in terms of importing smartphones. So what the business model was rebadging and reselling imported smartphones from countries like China. So they did cater to the large domestic market we had, but Chinese companies like Xiaomi and other companies, they figured they could use the same business model, set up the subsidiaries in India, and began importing completely boxed units of their smartphones, and they could outcompete Micromax, Carbon, and Lava on price, and therefore saturate the Indian market. So the problem with Carbon, Micromax, and Lava was that they were not manufacturing these smartphones themselves. So now that Micromax has been trying to manufacture smartphones themselves and even cater to the domestic market, let alone exports, it's difficult for them to compete on cost because input materials and intermediate components still continue to attract tariffs. Like I mentioned, populated printed circuit boards, which consist of soft system on chips like processors, etc., is still very expensive because of the added tariffs. So that's what I was referring to, not the fact that in the mid 2000s, these companies had a resurgence.
Right. So I will again sort of get all these points together. I guess what India's approach today is not very different from it was earlier, where imports or trade policy is seen as a way to sort of supercharge domestic manufacturing. And that has been India's position for a long time. In fact, there is a report by the ICEA, which is the industrial body of mobile manufacturers, and that itself says how India's approach is very different from Mexico, Vietnam, etc., where they have not used trade policy as a major instrument to spur domestic exports, right? So let the tariffs be low, don't focus on that. But the Indian government's position, like you said, with the phase manufacturing program, etc., is to very actively use high import tariffs with the vision that that will lead to more domestic manufacturing. But over and over, we've seen that's not the case. That has happened in reality. High import tariffs have only meant that our own products have become uncompetitive in the international space, and because they become uncompetitive, they don't cater to a big market, they just fizzle out, right? So we should always remember, even in mobile phones, all India combined is just an 8% market. That too, it will be at the lower end because our GDP per capita is low. So actually the market that the countries would want to target is the remaining 92%, right, which is outside India. And if you do that, you're competitive there, you will automatically be competitive in India as well. So I guess that's been the India's position for going back on its ITA commitments, so to say, and increasing tariffs, right? So now, what is the problem with this approach, Satya? What do you think has been the impact of this? How should we think about it?
Right. So, I mean, the most evident impact is the damaging of India's reputation as a reliable and rule-abiding trading partner internationally. So, we already know EU was potentially discussing retaliatory measures because of the ITA violations of India. So, aside from that, India will also probably lose its credibility and trustworthiness when negotiating new FTAs. The most recent example is India's ongoing negotiations with Taiwan, for instance. Now, why would TSMC want to come to India and establish even a single part of its operations in the value chain and expose its leading edge technology like fabrication, etc., to India if they're not assured that overall all the input materials and components that they're going to import as part of their operations will have a zero tariff? Like, why would they pay an extra 7.5 to 20% more for no reason?
So, but Satya, I think you're right, and I think that's stated position of Taiwan also. In fact, for example, one thing that should have come to India very easily is chip assembly, right? Not chip manufacturing, but chip assembly hasn't come to India, and one of the reasons is these tariff rates and also other random taxes that the government has increased. So this is the stated position of Taiwan, and it is important for listeners to know why this is the position, right? Like we said, because electronics manufacturing operates as a global value chain, if you want to export some electronics products, you also need a lot more imports, right? So Taiwan's biggest export is semiconductor chips, but their biggest imports is also chips, right? So you need more chips, you need to export more chips, right? So for example, if you are just doing assembly and you're just basically getting wafers and then you are doing the protective covering and making them into IC chips which can be exported, you will need to import the wafers, right? And you will need to import the equipment which goes into making these packages. So it can't happen suddenly that you will do this internally, and because you need a lot of these imports, you can't get rid of imports to zero. Neither Taiwan has, nor does US has done that, nor has China done it. So that's sort of the position of Taiwan. Indian government, by sort of imagining that this import tariffs will help these semiconductor companies, it has actually sort of probably driven them away, and India is not their most top destination, even though India has given excellent PLI schemes and excellent upfront capital support, right? So what are the other points, Satya?
So just adding to the point before, so India's rationale was partly to encourage tariff jumping FDI, where it was relying on its large consumer market to, for instance, entice foreign investment to set up their own subsidiaries locally and circumvent the tariff barriers that India has intentionally put. And that hasn't happened because of precisely what you said, global value chains and the way fragmented production networks work. All right, so going back to the next point, this is going back to the retaliatory measures that other countries can levy on India. So India is a huge IT-enabled services export market. Like TCS and Infosys are, I think, one of the leading service exporters to EU, for instance. Now, if EU decides to implement trade sanctions regarding in context of these companies, etc., because of India's violations of the ITA commitments, India's services exports are going to be affected immensely. Right. And then finally, in case India does comply with the WTO ruling, if the appellate board for that works out, India will probably have to revise or abandon its tariff and non-tariff measures that are challenged, and it might have to accept more stringent commitments in its new trade agreements. Right. So it also goes into constraining its policy flexibility and autonomy later down the line. So
yeah, Satya, I would slightly sort of disagree in the sense that this is not the most important reason. Like, I mean, okay, if another country is retaliating, I mean, that shouldn't be the reason why we change our policy. The reason why India should change the policy is precisely because it is
local manufacturing. Yeah.
ineffective in achieving the goal that India wants to achieve, right? So India's stated goal is to become electronics exporter. That cannot happen if you have high import tariffs, and that is, I think, the reason why. Most important reason why we shouldn't be doing it, right? So it is about unilaterally decreasing tariffs, not because EU will be angry or Japan will be angry. That those are small reasons. There are other means that India has at its disposal to sort of check those sort of actions, right?
So my point was simply to say that these are the possible repercussions of India's specific divergence from ITA commitments. Of course, the trade policy divergence from India is going to affect its manufacturing, export, and GVC integration goals. So so you're right.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Yeah, so in fact, if we want these PLI schemes to succeed, and in fact, there's a review that the government is doing, and it was in the newspapers today, then one of the components of that review should be that what is about our trade policy doing, and is our trade policy counterproductive to the aims of the PLI? Again, there is a lot of reportage on this, how most of the money that goes into PLI it claws back into paying the higher import tariffs. And this is an industry report. So in fact, government is giving PLI and that money is again going back to the government via import tariffs. It's not helping and the reason why PLI was implemented was to reduce cost disabilities. So you would have wanted companies to use this money to make their products cheaper. But that is not happening because it's just going into paying higher import tariffs. So again, a counterintuitive thing. And it's not as if the government doesn't know this. In fact, the report which we talked about, which ICRIER had released, it was in participation with the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. And they recognize that, in fact, you will have a reduction in value addition over the next few years as we get more integrated into the global value chains. And it is fine, right? As long as a lot of countries are doing their assembly, etc. in India, they establish bases in India. Over time, you will have a situation where there will be domestic capabilities in the component manufacturing as well. And that will happen because it is beneficial to these assembly plants to have local players, right? Not because of government policy. So that is what we would want to achieve, right? So what do you think is sort of the options that India has at this moment? What are the range of options? And then I'll ask you, what do you recommend? But just give us, what are the range of options that you have considered in your paper?
So, starting off with the most disruptive one is India can withdraw from the ITA agreement very specifically from the WTO. It's the Ministry of Commerce statement is what we're basing this on. So we have talked about the feasibility. Feasibility is pretty high because India seems to be distrustful of a lot of multilateral and plurilateral agreements regarding trade right now. It pulled out of the RCEP in a very dramatic manner as well. So political feasibility wise, it's very easy. Benefits, I'm not sure about. PLI schemes, like you mentioned, are helpful to an extent. Smartphone industry, assembly industry has benefited. It has almost no benefits if we withdraw the IT agreement because your input and intermediate components will become expensive. Local manufacturing will not be able to be cost competitive. And finally, will be excluded specifically from any global value chains for ICT products.
So I like that you started with the nuclear option first. Very important to discuss that. So so you're saying that if India were to actually withdraw from ITA, going beyond the current position of not sort of selectively agreeing to it. And you're saying that probably will not have any benefit. It will be counterproductive on many, many counts. And probably India should avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, strategically also, it's a lost opportunity if we don't want to usurp China's shares in GVCs, especially now that companies are trying to decouple from China, the supply chains from China, and move to other countries. Also, like initiatives of the Quad and the ISET with the USA, which is the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, will rely a lot on free movement of human capital and tech products, right? So that is also going to be undermined. Okay, so going on to the second option that we considered is just going ahead with what our current position is. Maintaining our status quo, which is primarily industrial and fiscal incentives based approach. Now, we already talked about how PLI schemes, the advantage or benefit of that is being primarily rerouted to pay for the high import tariffs in the first place. So what this also means that, like I said, what's going to happen is all the foreign investment is going to come to India only in terms of assembly, and it's going to stop that. Like the low value addition is going to be fine. Usually most countries would start off implementing liberal trade policies, start off with assembly, and then gradually move on the value chain. In India, that's not going to happen. It's going to stop because the only subsidy multinational companies are going to get is only for assembly, and that is the most profitable one for them. And again, India will not continue with the first option for China plus one strategies. Then the third option is basically us reiterating our commitment to ITA 1 in spirit as well as the black letter law, which is the divergence right now. I mean, we're not getting enough revenue from tariffs as it is, so we'll not lose out on any significant tariffs. The only issue I could see is that low quality electronics can be dumped in India, but then there are other avenues to address that. There are other laws that we can use to address that, or we can have clauses in the agreements, or we can ask for concessions from the WTO for that. Right.
So, and I would say, Satya, that low quality electronics goods available in India shouldn't be a problem. It's good as long as the safety considerations are met. It shouldn't. I mean, in fact, the one thing that even our listeners would be interested in knowing is just see your mobile phone or your laptop prices over the last 5-6 years. They wouldn't have dropped. Actually, if you see electronics products, you all know that these prices keep dropping spectacularly over time, right? The same tech, because there are improvements, the old tech becomes very cheap, right? So this we saw in the period between 2010 to 2015, right? Every year you had a new mobile phone, and the mobile phone which was 1 year old kept dropping, right? You could get a great phone for 14,000-15,000, but you wouldn't see that over the last 5-6 years. Prices have stuck. There are many reasons for this, but one reason also is that India has increased tariffs on many of these products. It makes things costly. So, yeah, I mean, if there are low quality or low price products, it should be fine. I mean, the consumer has to then judge what is good for them, what is not good for them.
Yeah, sure. So the main, I think, concern here is in terms of environmental issues. Like I said, there are different regulations to handle that as well. So that shouldn't be a consideration here. The benefits are that enhanced regulatory certainty will incentivize foreign investment almost immediately. Like you've seen this in other sectors, especially, right? So India currently has 100% automatic FDI, but that hasn't been taken advantage of because of high tariff barriers. Though technology transfer is probably the most guaranteed benefit under this approach, because the moment you have investors like TSMC come in, that the local partners in India are going to be exposed to this technology and the training as well. So, and strategic benefits are self-explanatory because India's standing in the WTO and Quad will increase. India's standing in negotiations while negotiating FTAs with Taiwan, for example, will also increase because of this. The other option, which is slightly more difficult to envisage right now, is India acceding to the ITA 2 expansion and also entering the negotiations for the third expansion of ITA. The reason it's difficult to project is because we do not know as to how much more tariff revenue we might lose out, because the product categories covered in these expansions can also negatively affect domestic production for multiple manufacturing sectors. Medical equipment production, for instance, or 3D printing may be able to subsume other domestic industries. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is difficult, but these outcomes need to be projected first. So, and the benefits are broadly similar to what following the ITA 1 in spirit would also entail. The final one is somewhat supplementary, but this is also be considered in its own mutually exclusive form, is that we can simply enter into free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, or other preferential trade agreements strategically with countries which are dominant in global value chains, like Taiwan, Korea and China is probably difficult to go ahead with, or Vietnam, etc., is because we have prior experience in lowering import costs of final products via FTAs, etc., from Korea, for instance, right, TVs and cars. This will be easier for movement of human capital. We'll get easier training immediately. And a lot of these FTAs, RTAs will also have clauses relating to reduction of non-tariff barriers, right, for customs clearance and delays, etc., will also be negotiated in them. So this will also mean strong backward linkage. It means input materials like, for say, lithium from Australia and other materials from negotiating countries will be direct results. So that means India's deep tech startups, for instance, who are working in battery technology, will be able to get these input materials cheaply and more extensively. And that means giving an impetus to startups in emerging technologies in India. Finally, this may or may not be a beneficial consideration, but we can become an extension of the partner country's specialization in a particular stage of the value chain. For instance, if we enter into an FTA with Taiwan, we can focus on enabling local capacity for semiconductor fabrication only, which is a huge deal. But that's an example. Finally, strategically, it will enhance supply chain resiliency within the satellite economies we're part of, and that's about it. So, yeah.
So, Miheer, you had some point.
Yeah, so the FTAs point that Satya mentioned, Mexico is a great example to look at when you look at FTAs, because it is not a signatory on the ITA, but it has so many FTAs with so many different countries. A lot of it's, and also regional parties, regional cooperation groups like some in South America, the European Union, ASEAN. Right? So it's a very great example to look at FTAs. So even though it is not a signatory on the ITA, a lot of its input materials are very cheap because it has so many FTAs with so many other countries.
Good point. Yeah, thanks. I think, Satya, one point I would emphasize is that thinking of tariffs as a source of revenue is probably one of the worst ways to look at tariffs. I think if the government is doing that, it's mistaken, because that was the position pre-liberalization. A large portion of our government revenue was made out of custom duties and the very high custom duties we had. None of that resulted in India having a great industry. In fact, that was the reason why we didn't get any industry, right? So, in fact, whatever reduction you do in tariffs, you will probably make up for it more than many number of times through the GST in local manufacturing, etc. Right? So, if you have a bigger economy, obviously your taxes will improve. So, using tariffs, the only justifiable reason I would say is this kind of reasoning. Maybe you don't want certain strategic sectors to have things coming from China, or maybe at some position in the government's view, some form of protectionism is required for some areas. I don't subscribe to that view, but probably the reason could be that they want to to have some domestic alternatives, right? Whatever that reason might be, that I can understand, though I won't empathize with it. But if revenue is a consideration, I think that's not even justifiable by any definition whatsoever.
Just adding to that, Pranay, so the things you mentioned about protectionism required for some sectors, the issue I believe is the government may be trying to avoid the mistake that it did in acceding to the ITA one without also having a coherent policy for certain manufacturing sectors. So if that happens again, then that could maybe lead to loss of jobs or whatever, but also a reduction in domestic manufacturing capacity. So when we're talking about projecting outcomes, we have to project that, figure out how to link it to a cohesive manufacturing policy for those sectors, and then see if we need to access to ITA2, etc.
So then we already have now an industrial policy, for good or worse. We have a lot of these things. So now you're saying it makes sense for India to actually be more confident in its approach to the ITA, to actually sign ITA 1, probably even think of ITA 2. I don't know. So what is your final recommendation? Out of the options you mentioned, what is the one that you would recommend today, given whatever the situation is?
I would say reiterating its and signaling its commitment to ITA 1 would be the easiest option. Alongside that, the whole thing about building free trade agreements and regional trade agreements in India's favor would be a supplementary course of action, because A, it immediately strengthens India's economic and bargaining position. B, it avoids retaliatory measures by any of these countries. And C, the immediate impact would be easier establishment of local operations by multinational companies, because we have Desh, I think, replacing SEZs. SEZs did not have the best track record. We have Desh, we have a national logistics policy, we have PLI scheme constantly being revisited. We have something like the Indian Semiconductor Mission with a outlay, which can also be reiterated upon and revised the moment more multinational companies come in. So along with this cohesive approach in domestic manufacturing, this kind of thing is going to have the most immediate impact. Of course, the longer term course of action would be to project outcomes by the MeitY and the Department of Commerce regarding ITA 2 and 3. But I believe that takes at least 5 to 10 years, I would say, because of India's large and burgeoning manufacturing sector.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, you have a more informed view that both of you have studied this. I would go on a limb and say that India should sign the ITA 2 and 3. We are going to lose out on a lot of things like we did in the ITA 1 regime if we don't get our act together now. And also we should remember China, because it was a big player, it has gotten exemptions and concessions in ITA 2, which today India is looked at as a favorable alternative. So I guess it will get the kind of concessions which it couldn't in the past because of the geopolitical climate, and that India can use in its favor today. Probably that won't be true 5-6 years down the line, right? We don't know what the geopolitics of that period would be. So I would go on from a sort of an amateurish point of view. That would be my argument. But I take your point that at least following ITA 1 is sort of a requirement that we should have in our arsenal for developing electronics manufacturing. It is an enabler, not impediment, and that's the mindset shift which is sort of required. Now, finally, we've talked about this a lot, but my last question to both of you was, there is a lot of arguments in the recent time, a good discussion, I would say, on how PLIs would only lead to increasing assembly and nothing else, right? And there was a spirited discussion on this a few days ago. What is your view on this? Miheer, I'll start with you and then Satya.
Yeah, so the discussion kind of started when Raghuram Rajan, the ex-governor of the RBI, wrote a note about how PLI schemes have not actually benefited, especially the PLI scheme in the electronics industry hasn't really benefited India, in terms that because a lot of companies have established their factories to manufacture in India, they still have to import a lot of components and they just assemble them in India. They don't really add a lot of value. They just use the cheap labor cost in India to assemble them. So his point essentially is that the value of inputs is more, or the value that things that we import is more than the value of what we export, which means that the PLI schemes have not really benefited Indian manufacturing. And even though we export a lot, doesn't mean we export a lot in value. So that is the main argument that he was making. And then the sort of answer to that hasn't been really, I don't know, it's not very coherent what the government answer to that is. But yeah, he's also compared a lot of other PLI schemes and how much jobs they've generated, and that the electronics industry PLI scheme hasn't generated a lot of jobs like that. So that is basically where the argument about the PLI scheme starts.
And adding to that, so Rajan's point is that domestic value addition is only about 4% in a high-end smartphone, etc. I'm not sure why he drew a conclusion about the fact that PLI schemes essentially are not useful, because, like you mentioned, but at the very beginning of the podcast, that any country which is liberalizing its import tariff regime for ICT products will inevitably gain investment in assembly plants itself, because that is not as highly capital intensive as setting up manufacturing facilities, and it plays into a comparative advantage of these countries, which is lower labor cost and comparatively higher skill in electronics or something like that. Right. So that is perfectly fine. Like if India is liberalizing its import tariffs, and like in the recent budget, a lot of input components to smartphones have been, I think, eliminated. Stuff like that is going to always happen. Like assembly and testing is always going to be the entry point for investment. However, like you mentioned, as technology transfer begins to happen, as technology demonstration begins to happen, our workforce can continue to build local capacity there. And then we can move up the value chain as we decrease tariffs on other input products like semiconductors, etc.
Yeah, I agreed with both of you. I think the criticism that the government is not putting out data on the number of jobs generated or the amount of value added is quite fair, and that the government must do, given there's so much amount of tax money which is being poured into 14 sectors now, right? I don't
Yeah.
know, last count was 40. If it is increased, I don't know, Miheer, you would know, but it is already increased to so many sectors, so it is important that government puts that data. Having said that, I thought, yeah, it was quite surprising to see the argument that it is only leading to assembly. Of course, it will only lead to assembly in the first phase. That is how it was in Vietnam. That is how it was in China. So
Yeah, exactly.
I think in terms of that same argument, which is you have to first, which the Ecrier report made, which you have to first globalize to localize, right? You can't do globalization and localization simultaneously. We've been trying to do that over many decades. It hasn't worked. So both China and Vietnam saw a decrease in domestic value added per unit of demand while they were actually globalizing and integrating themselves into the supply chain. And over time, there were domestic alternatives that developed. And that happened because, for example, in the Apple ecosystem, once this final assembly and testing packaging, the FATP units, which are like Foxconn, etc., they are the key nodes in any manufacturing ecosystem. So once they take its root in a particular country, it's in their self-interest to develop a local supplier ecosystem, because they have to, meet the unsparing demands of the product launch cycle, where they have to produce a product every year before Christmas, and that it is important for them to have a closely knit local supplier ecosystem to meet those kinds of targets. So that will happen over time. I don't think we need to look assembly with a derision. Assembly is good. We were not even doing this earlier. So as long as we are doing assembly and having a large, getting integrated into the global ecosystem, over time we'll also catch up with the local component ecosystem.
Yeah, yes, also, yeah, adding to that,
simultaneously it has disadvantages. Yeah.
so adding to that, and so we have seen it in other sectors as well. The moment you have assembly or the last part of the value chain getting foreign investment, local sourcing inevitably comes as a byproduct, not that byproduct, as a natural consequence of that. Like we can't force it. So right now the government's local sourcing requirements are fairly onerous, which they keep changing in an ad hoc manner. But forcing that basically means that foreign companies are only at this point have to source maybe bad quality equipment or components which they cannot have quality assurances for. The moment that happens, these manufacturers or companies themselves will start creating forward linkages based on who the most suitable partner is. So that is something we're missing right now.
Okay, thank you, Satya and Miheer, for this conversation. I recommend all our listeners to do check that paper out that both of you have written. We'll link it in the show notes. I think it's a really important paper on topic that is less discussed, but it has a lot of significance on India's manufacturing strategy going ahead. So with that, we'll end this episode. Do let us know how you found this episode, and if you have any suggestions for the paper or for ATP in general, we'll be happy to know that. So with that, we'll end this episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.